this is the way that people were thinking until fairly recently. In the 1930s, that was when the Big Bang Theory started, the idea that there was a beginning to the world. The existence as we know it, it became more accepted in the 1960s, but until then, it was the prevailing assumption among scientists that the world did not have a creation, and that was very much, it would be very hard to square the Bible, to square the Torah with such an idea. Now we have, issues of when that creation began, but we have to realize that there was at least in the 1960s, there was a tremendous step forward in bringing these two things together. But anyways, the RAMBAN says that there was a time where people denied this. They didn't think that the world actually had a beginning. So that's one false ideology that people had. That's probably the most flawed. And there are those that denied instead God's specific knowledge of what's going on in the world. For Amru, they would say, how could God know? Is there really knowledge up on high? Does God have any idea what's going on around here? Right? They think that God created the world and he's totally oblivious to what goes on to it afterwards. Right? So that's another false ideology. There are those that would admit to the fact that God knows what's going on here, he's watching us. But they denied providence. They, in their philosophy, made man as if he was the fish of the sea. That God doesn't actually oversee in the sense of intervening when necessary in their lives. And that there's no concept of reward and punishment for people. So Yomru Ozav Hashem es haaretz, they say that God abandoned the world, that he abandoned it in the sense of involvement. He knows what's going on, but he doesn't choose to be involved in it anymore. Okay, so those are all false ideologies that people had, starting from the days of Enosh. Now, if God wants, either in a public sphere or to a private individual, and he chooses to do a sign or a wonder that involves, and that's a key phrase, I'll have to keep that in mind when we talk about comparing this to the film that we saw on Motzei Shabbos, with he's changing the way of the natural world. So then it becomes known to all of these people, and it totally nullifies their false views when they see this. When people that thought that either God didn't create the world, that the world was always existing, or that he doesn't know what's going on, or that he's not involved, when there are miracles that happen to save somebody or a group of people, that denies all of these things. The miracle, in one way, it proves that the world was created and renewed by a God. That concept itself is actually kind of hard to understand. That's philosophically difficult. Just in the same way that, let's say, clay could exist prior to my own existence, and it'll exist afterwards, right? I could be living within that, and at the same time, I have the ability to shape it in any way I want. So it's hard to explain exactly how, let's say the world was eternal, that there was no beginning and end, so to speak. But it really, when God does a miracle, does that really demonstrate the fact that God has, that he created the world also? It's not so clear. Philosophically,
this is all just part of RAMBAN's belief system.
Mm-hmm.
He's merely enunciating his own belief in Yadut and Hashem.
But he's trying to prove it.
Philosophy can't prove anything. This is philosophy.
Right, but there's philosophical speculations that the world was never created. RAMBAN thinks that a miracle will disprove that. Right, so that's it's hard to explain exactly why. I think the closest way to understand it is, and this is an Aristotelian view, that the world was always in existence. When we say always, by that we also mean not conditional on anything. It didn't need a God to will it into existence, if that's the way you look at things. It is just because it is, and if it is just because it is, it's also unshapable. Anything that exists outside of, so let's say a person that agreed that there was a God, but that God didn't create the world, he would say that in some ways the world is static and unchangeable, to the sense that God would not be able to change it. So if you have God changing the world, so that shows that the world is just because it is, and it's dependent on God's will. That's a very hard esoteric concept to figure out. In some ways, I've heard that even within Aristotle's view, it's kind of shaky. How one point leads to another. But in any event, the RAMBAN feels that a miracle can deny the validity of such a claim, that there was no beginning to the world. But the other ones are easier to understand. But we also understand through God doing a miracle, that God knows what's going on, umashgiach, and that he's involved. He's an overseer. He gets involved when necessary. And he has infinite ability to do so. Right? Those are more clear. Right? When the Jewish people need help, and God creates miracle for the Jewish people. So clearly, it seems to be in response to that need, that He knows that they have that need, and that He gets involved. He's the one that splits the sea. He's the one that allows them to pass through. It clearly proves those points. And now when you have those very same wonders and miracles that we're talking about, that those were first foretold by a prophet, it clarifies even one more principle, that there's truth to the concept of nevuah, that God talks to people. Right? God talks to people, and He reveals His secrets to His servants, the prophets. When you have a miracle, it establishes all of the principles, main principles, core principles that the Torah is based on. It's a very important point. There's people that came before the RAMBAN, nobody ever really explained until he did the centrality of miracles to our philosophy, right? Or specifically miracles that happened on a historical, national level. So it's a very key function of what the RAMBAN is in his general outlook on the world. And in a paragraph, he basically just summed it up. It's probably the most important idea of his that he has in his entire commentary. So he continues. And therefore it says, with regards to the miracles, with regards to the plagues that happened in Egypt, God says that it should be known that I am within the entire land. That's meant to teach God He's within the land. He's involved. He's an overseer. He doesn't just abandon the world to happenstance, as certain people think. He also says in another pasuk in previous parshas, that the world should know that the world, that the entire earth belongs to God. To also prove the chidush, God's renewal, His creation of the world. Right? That's a general principle. The clearest way I could ever say that something actually belongs to me is if I'm the one that creates it. Right? So God showing that the world belongs to Him, so to speak, that's also showing that He created it in that way, that He created from nothing. And also says, God says that it should be known that there's no one like me in the entire world. If you look at the entire Yetzias Mitzrayim narrative, these are all psukim that come up in different locations where God says the purpose of the makos of the miracles is to make this known, to make that known, to make this known. So this last one, that there's no one like me in the entire world, what's that referring to? Lahoros al hayicholes. To teach the world about the fact that God has the ultimate ability. Shehut shalit bakol. He's the one that rules over everything. Ein ma'akvo biyado. There's nothing there that can actually stop Him from doing what He wants. Ki b'chol zeh hayu mitzrayim machishin o mistapkim. All of these elements, these are all philosophies that the Egyptians, these ideas, they're ideas that the Egyptians denied or that they were not so clear about. And therefore, all of these signs and wonders, they are faithful witnesses to all of the essential, faith concepts that we have in the entire Torah. So it's really it's a phenomenal idea. Now he's going to talk about why this is so relevant. Now, why is he bringing it up here? Obviously, in the storyline, it's very clear. When we're talking about Yetzias Mitzrayim, he doesn't bring it up at the beginning or even in the middle or even at the end. We still have Kriyas Yamsuf to go later on in next week's Parsha in Beshalach. So why is he bringing it up now? Because this is at the end of Parsha Bo. If you look, it tells you two parshas. It talks about Pidyon B'chor, about redeeming the firstborn, and it talks about writing the passages of these things in Tefillin. It's a custom that some have. I try to do when I have time. I think it's extremely important. In the Siddurim, they have two paragraphs that you read, the passages that are in your Tefillin. So, the first two paragraphs of Shema and V'haya, so those are in your Tefillin also. You say those out of necessity because we have an obligation to say Kriyas Shema every day. But the other two paragraphs, those aren't ones that we would necessarily, come across. And in many ways, it makes it hard to really grasp. Sometimes when I was younger, I remember not realizing what's inside my tefillin. You have those parshias, and somebody that reads them every day, if he reads them after he puts on his tefillin, he internalizes much more what's going on in them and what they're all about. So those are the parshias that Parshas Bo closes with. So the RAMBAN, he's bringing up these ideas to tell you a very important idea of the mitzvahs, and he's going to continue. Because God's not going to do a miracle in each and every generation before the eyes of every wicked or a person or somebody who is a heretic. So first of all, why wouldn't He do that? Anybody have any ideas? Why wouldn't God? People always say, "Give me a sign." I would love to have a miracle that would tell me that I should do the right thing here. And God won't do that for us typically, right? So why not?
It would take away your bechira.
Yes, precisely. So that's something that is elaborated on in other places. And Rabbi Dessler is a big point in his philosophy of that if God was so open and in your face all the time on a constant basis, there wouldn't be free choice. It would be so obvious that God's watching you, that there's a system of reward and punishment, that when somebody let's say important that's in charge of you is walking by, you don't do anything wrong because the consequences are much more real to you, and it's too easy to make the right decision, so to speak, in such situations. God wants us to have free will. He wants us to make the right choices from our internal convictions, and not from the fact that we're being watched and that we're going to get punished.
And the consequences would become immediate.
Right.
Or they could become very immediate.
Struck by a bolt of lightning anytime, right? So that would be interesting. So God's not going to do that because it's going to, I guess, break down the entire system of how the world's supposed to work.
The corollary to that is that if Dar Yitzhak Mitzrayim did see Aliyah,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and still, notwithstanding that they had been in Mitzrayim, and still could not bring themselves to completely.
Right. So something we talked about last week. We talked about the idea of hardening Paro's heart. Right, so separate. So it's typically thought of as a separate idea. The Sforno, his insight that we talked about last week, he mentions that it's people usually view that as a contradiction to the idea of free choice, right? That God's taking away your free choice. He's forcing you to make the wrong decision, so to speak. He says it's the opposite. It's that if a person's going through these makos, that's the lightning bolts. That's the God in your face experience. Is that anybody in their right mind would make the right choices there. Sforno says it's the opposite. Hardening Paro's heart, hardening even the Egyptians' heart, towards the beginning of this week's parsha, is what gives them their free choice back. It gives them the strength to withstand the makos that now it's not so obvious, even when these things are going on. It's a very interesting approach that he had. But there's other approaches. The RAMBAN said a totally different idea, but the idea that certainly, at least in a general sense, we want to keep up free will. We want to keep that going. So that's certainly a foundation of the Torah. So RAMBAN says we're not going to do this all the time. God's not going to make a miracle for people just to satisfy every Rasha or somebody that says, give me a sign. But nevertheless, we want to internalize the fact that God is running the world. So therefore, and God wants us to have that too. He commands us, therefore, that we should create for us a remembrance that we should always have within eyesight. But not tikadavar al b'neinu. We should be able to transmit these matters to our children, their children to their children, and their children and so forth to the final generations. And the Torah is very particular about this. For example, that a person is chayiv karis. That term is very common. It's a severe punishment. It's a very severe punishment for eating chametz, for eating bread on Passover. We would think that that's not such a big deal. Very often you might maybe have that frustration while you're cleaning for Pesach. Why do I have to do this? This is crazy. Anybody that's not Jewish that sees what you're doing will probably think you're crazy. So Ramban right now is talking about why is this such a serious matter? Why is eating bread on Passover such a big deal? If a person, let's say in times where the Beit Midrash is existing and we're able to bring the carbon Pesach, somebody that doesn't do so, so he also has the punishment of karis, also a big deal. We have another mitzvah also, like he said before this piece that we started with. He was talking about tefillin, right? Tefillin is meant to be a Zichron DOV Mitzrayim. We also write on the mezuzahs that we have in each and every doorway. We talk about Yetzias Mitzrayim. And we make sure that we mention it morning and evening. Like it says the Gemara in Brachos, emes v'yatziv d'oraisa. And when we say the paragraph in Shachris, right, if there's Shema, emes v'yatziv, that's a biblical obligation. Now, what do they mean by that? Right? Because that was a tefillah, a prayer, as the Rambam explains. That was a tefillah that was coined by Chazal. It was written by the Rabbi. So how can you tell me it's a biblical obligation to say it? So he says, Mimasha Kasav, the reason why it's a biblical obligation is because the Torah itself says, L'man tizkar es yom tzeischa me'eretz Mitzrayim, kol yemei chayeka. You have to remember the day that you left Egypt, all the days of your life. Meaning the bracha that Chazal formulated was meant to satisfy that requirement. You could do it technically with other words, but that's the way that we typically do it. V'shanas sukkah b'chol shana, we make a sukkah each and every year. That's also to remember our leaving Egypt, that we lived in sukkos, or that we were, whatever you want to say, protected by the clouds of glory. It's supposed to remind us of that whole trip. We have so many mitzvahs that are meant to be a memorial to Yetzias Mitzrayim. It says that we have so much going on and so many of them carry tremendous implications, very severe punishments for everything we do. And he's saying why, right? But based on what we've just read before, what's he basically getting at? Why are these things so important? Why if I eat a loaf of bread on Pesach, like I have kares, that I have a spiritual excision? Why such a big deal? So he explains even these more minor mitzvahs, the ones that we think are, that you can't imagine them being as significant as, let's say, killing a person. Well, it isn't, but it is significant anyways. So he's saying the reason why is because all these mitzvahs that are meant to remind us of leaving Egypt, is to remind us not just of the fact that we left Egypt, but the ideas that whole experience represents. He says you look at the miracles that happened that got us out of here, those are all meant to allude, those all prove key concepts in Judaism. Anytime you don't do those mitzvahs, you could in many ways be denying those foundations. The person doesn't eat, if the person eats chametz, so he's not complying with the need to remember this very crucial moment in Jewish history. And that's what he's explaining. That's why he says these are so important. All of these signs and things that we have there, they're meant to remind us of these miracles, that we shouldn't forget them. And it's so that there shouldn't be a pretext to anybody that wants to be a heretic and deny that these things happened, and he denies faith in God. He has one of these false ideologies from before. Okay? So if a person, if let's say the Jewish people didn't actually take great steps to remember these experiences, right? To remember leaving Egypt, we didn't have mitzvahs like tefillin and Passover Seder and not eating chametz, etc. So even though they happened historically, right? You can even have it written in the Torah. It's much easier to question the veracity of such a story. People do even now. If you're at that filming on Moshe Shabbos, you see that people still do. But it's much more of a reliable story to cling on to understand, and to believe that it actually happened, when you know that each subsequent generation after the Jewish people left Egypt, we were crazy about Yetzias Mitzrayim. We did so many things. We cleaned our houses from bread. We did extreme actions that seemed totally unreasonable, but we realized we did them because they represent a very important ideal. And when we treat these things seriously, that shows that there's been a sense of belief in these historical events from generation to generation to generation. If it wasn't so important, people wouldn't do these things. You have something to say?
That's what I think is a fundamental weakness of RAMBAN's opening here, where he talks about all these things being proved to the world. We have a tradition where we pass it down midor lador.
Mm-hmm.
That's what makes it real to us. There's no such tradition in the world, and therefore to use the logic as a proof that it exists is just, as I say, it's merely an expression of his faith. It has nothing to do with the rest of the world. It's a basic flaw of philosophy.
One could ask. If one was to ask this on the Ramban's approach, you could at the same time know that, let's say I'm not a Jewish person, but I know, and history attests to this, that the Jewish people were always doing these things, these seemingly crazy things.
No question about it.
They still would be able to question it. It's one thing to just say, people aren't always reasonable, but to say that you had generations and generations of people that were very, very scared to have even a morsel of bread in their house on Passover. We assume that people are more intelligent than that. If they're not doing it for a good reason, that custom should just fade away. The fact that it didn't means that there's a certain importance to it. I'm sure that there are skeptics even with that, but the Rambam thinks that this is the idea of a transmission from generation to generation. That's I think something that most Jews would relate to. That's a very important piece of the puzzle in understanding how all these things are true. Right? For us alone. So why for us alone? If
our faith and our belief does not convince someone else that they must be right. That's what you're saying.
It's not my observance alone of Passover that I think
our
is
observance alone, regardless, it's our religious observance of it all through the generations. If someone were to come from outer space and say, look at these Jews, they're still doing this, and they say it's because they learned it one generation, they must be right, I better join the club. That's the natural corollary to that.
That would be a natural reaction.
That would
be.
You're
saying that's not what would happen.
But it's not what happens. The world, maybe that's why they had to have decisions, that there was an innovation, that perhaps the reason that the new religions have come as a new revelation is so crucial to them, because they can't deny ours. Perhaps they have discomfort denying ours.
That's I think a major reason why so many of the two other major world religions of Islam and Christianity, they don't deny the foundations of the Jewish faith. They don't. They say certain things were changed afterwards, but nobody said nobody in those faiths say there was no experience at Har Sinai, etc. Because that's a key component of our religion as well. The fact that these miracles, that all these things happen on a public level, that you don't have that in any other religion. You have in Christianity, you have Paul saying that he experienced some kind of nevuah. So at the end of the day, he said something. We're relying on the evidence of one person. You have in Islam, Muhammad having what you would have thought maybe is an epileptic fit, but instead it's him saying, no, the God spoke to me and he says you should do this and that. It's on the word of one person. Whereas where you have these miracles, you have Yetzias Mitzrayim, you have the giving of the Torah that happened on a mass level. That's something that's very hard to deny happening. People still do, and it's if you get to the core of things, if you're to ask, the people, let's say whoever it is that espouses these theories, how they account for the fact that there seems to be a large group of people claiming that a tremendous miracle happened to all these people at the same time and they could all attest to it. They're going to have to strain to find some kind of way to explain it. It's difficult. It is. And for that's the reason why the Jewish people say, the reason why we say it happened is because it did happen. And there's a certain veracity to it. But it's always something to explore.
I think his logic is faulty because first of all, the Jewish nation is the smallest nation in the world. Mm-hmm. We cannot compare it to the other religions. And so what we're doing to observe all the mitzvahs of Pesach and Sukkot and all the other holidays, it's a sign that we will be vindicated. We will be vindicated. We are a notice to the world. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter if they believe it or they're not joining because of the truth of all of it.
I think Zev agrees with you. For us, that's really happening, right? But that for ourselves within the Jewish people, that's for sure, right? That's what you're saying.
No, but
not denying that.
We're an example to the world.
Mm-hmm. If you want to get into the head,
it's not internal; it's external.
If you want to get in the head of, let's say, somebody in academia, or let's say, average Joe on the street that doesn't follow the Jewish faith, and you were to tell, you learn this RAMBAN with him, right? What would he say? I'm not sure. It's something along the lines of speculation of maybe it didn't really happen, etc. And you'd have to really get into the process of, how could they explain this phenomenon taking place in another way, in a way that seems sensible. It'd be very hard to. There's a lot of shiurim. I'm sure you've probably heard at some point in your life this approach that what makes Judaism unique. I'll send after this class, I'll send an email. I'll send a link to a very important class given by Rabbi Lawrence Kellerman. He has a book called Permission to Believe. Anybody ever see that book? He has some form of the lecture in lecture form where he talks about the truth of the Torah, of the fact that the Jewish people actually experienced all these things, and he says in a very convincing way that it's you'd be very hard pressed to understand how such a story could be made up. And he was in academia. He actually was involved in comparative study of religions in UCLA, and he came to the point where he realized, I can't debunk this. I can't debunk this Judaism thing. And then he went and followed it. This is a very interesting lecture that he has, so I'll send it to everybody. Anyway, so let's continue. So he says, the RAMBAN says, all of the things that we have in all generations that are meant to serve as testimonies and signs, that they're all that we don't forget these concepts. So that there shouldn't be a pretext, like we said, in the mouth of any heretic to deny fundamental ideas of the Jewish faith. This is what he said, there's somebody that just buys a mezuzah for however much it costs. Not so expensive. But kava papisko, and he sets it on his doorway, and he has an intent. That's an important qualification. He has to have the right kavanas when he's doing this. He has to understand what he's doing. You have to realize what that action represents. By doing that, kvar hoda b'chidush ha'olam, he is attesting to the fact that there is a creator in the world through this action, that God knows what's going on in the world and that he's involved in it. V'gam b'nevuah, he's also testifying to the idea of prophecy, that God speaks to people. V'amin b'chol pinos haTorah, and he therefore believes, those are all key concepts that everything grows out of, all the other aspects of Torah. Besides the fact that he's also testifying in the second paragraph of Kriya Shema, which is in the mezuzahs, the idea of skar v'onish, that God does, he rewards those that do his ratzon. And then he took us out from bondage to freedom. And that there was a tremendous honor that was given over to the Jewish people in the merit of their forefathers who were Yirei Elokim, that feared God. Therefore it says in Avos, Hevizar b'mitzvah kala kivachamura. Be very careful. There's probably a well-known passage in Avos. I don't know how many people explain this in the same way that the RAMBAN does. It says you should be very careful about a light mitzvah, just like you are about a heavy mitzvah, so to speak. All of them are desired and beloved to God. To each and every one of them, the RAMBAN says, a person is admitting to fundamental concepts and understandings about the Creator. I think most understand that Mishnah Avos. Don't try to figure out the reward and punishment of each and every mitzvah. Don't say, oh well, Chil Shabbos is it's a very severe punishment, so I'm going to focus on that and not focus on the other stuff. Focus on everything. Prioritize everything. But the way the Ramban says it is, don't think that the amount of effort you have to put into a certain mitzvah in any way attests to the value of it. Which you might think. I think there's, things that Chazal say that actually would seem to indicate that way. The Tzara Agra, that the amount of toil is commensurate with the reward, right? But don't think that it's a very easy mitzvah to do. I put it up once, I'm done with, and then it's in my house all the time. So the Ramban says no. It's a very light mitzvah, but the significance of it, the philosophical deepness of what's going on when a person does it, he does it in the right way. There's so much. Every time you pass by a mezuzah and you kiss it, that could be an act of tremendous significance in a person's hashkafa. That's the way he interprets the Mishnah Avos. It's interesting. Okay, so that's his point. That's the first point that he makes in this famous passage that he has. If you were to ask somebody, why do we have so many mitzvahs that are Zecher Yetzias Mitzrayim? So this is the answer. Yetzias Mitzrayim was a very important part of our history, something that attests to so many things that we believe in, and that's why we really want to hold on to it. Without that, it's we could be lost, philosophically trying to prove things, which doesn't always work out well in the end. Trying to come to the truths of the Torah through philosophical speculation and thinking about things in our mind. But when something actually happened historically that proves certain events, that proves certain concepts, it's much more powerful. It's much harder to deny those things. So when a person actually has mitzvahs that are to remind him of those experiences, it accomplishes a tremendous amount. Rabbi Kravkin's also very big in talking about this in the Kuzari. The author of the Kuzari, he was somebody also that he didn't put much faith in philosophical analysis. So instead, it's the fact that we have, like the Torah tells us, to have all these remembrances of all these historical, occasions, because at the end of the day, philosophy can lead you in many directions. So if you have a historical event that you can assume that it really happened based on the way the Jewish people have been acting for generations and generations in our mitzvah observance, so that's something that's a much more solid base to hang your faith on, so to speak. And other Chachamim, the Rambam among them, certainly view philosophy as an important tool also towards getting to maybe even a more profound knowledge of God. So that's not necessarily the way that everybody of the Chachmei Masorah felt. That's one important point that the Rambam has. And now we have something that is, I think, more alludes to the topic that was in Saturday night. So you have the Rambam continuing now. He says, "Umin hanisim hagadolim hamaforsamim adam modim hanisim hanistarim." When you have a person that admits to the tremendous open miracles that happen in the world, he is by definition also admitting to the, so to speak, hidden miracles. Shem Yesod Torah Kula. And this is a matter which is a foundation of the entire Torah. Anybody have any idea how to expand on that before we go further? Why would open miracles prove, so to speak, the small hidden miracles? The fact that I'm breathing right now, the fact that the world operates in some sense of equilibrium. That things work out well. So there's an idea. If you're at the Hanukkah shir, we talked about this a little bit. Also by Rabbi Dessler, he wrote Mechtav Me'Eliyahu, Lithuanian Rosh Yeshiva. So he describes how, what is the difference between miracle and the non-miraculous. He says, if you have a concept like, let's say, an open miracle like Tchias HaMesim, the revival of the dead, the resurrection of the dead. Whenever that happens, and we believe that it will, that'll be very interesting, because that'll be very surprising. That'll be, wow, that's never happened before. Bones, reassemble, form into a human being, come out of the ground. And that's pretty impressive. We would call that an open miracle. And at the same time, he says, explain to me why when you take a seed, right, you put it in the ground, it begins to decay and start growing into a tree, and all of a sudden a tree pops up later when you water it and there's sunlight, etc. All the right conditions are there. Why does that happen? Right? If I was to say that's understandable when you plant a seed and it forms into a tree. But why is Chiyas HaMesim more surprising to you? What would you say? Why is one more surprising than the other?
One appears to defy what we've defined as nature, as natural. One appears to require the visible hand of Hashem, and the other does not appear to have the visible hand of Hashem.
No, it just happens all the time. Occurrence.
Yeah, I think you're saying the same thing. The way what we define as nature, this is what Rabbi Ezra says. Nature, by our definition, is essentially it's what happens that we're used to. It's the things that happen over and over again. You can't explain ultimately an ultimate why as to why a seed grows into a tree. We can explain. Anytime you ask a scientist, why is this happening? Why is this happening? He'll tell you, because this chemical reaction happens. Eventually, you get to the ultimate why. I'm not asking what's the processes that take place. I'm asking to what purpose this happens, and scientists can't answer that question. The reason why is because it's all because God wills it. Miracles in nature, they're really all things that are the expression of God's desire. But the world that we call nature, those are things that we're used to. That's the only difference. So the RAMBAN says here, you have big miracles that take place. Those themselves, right? When you have certain incidents that show, like we said earlier, those show that God specifically willed these things to happen, right? They're a clear display of hashgacha, of God's divine providence, right? So once you see that God's running those, then you come to the philosophical conclusion that really all these things, there's no reason one thing should be different than the other. It's all the same. Just certain things we're used to, certain things we're not. So God's really in control of everything. God's really doing all of the nisim nistarim, the hidden miracles, so to speak, as well. It's a she'ina adam chilik b'Torah Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is where he says a rather severe statement, and we'll have to analyze more about this RAMBAN soon. If we take it in the way I think that I just explained, this is going to be a very severe statement. She'in adam chilek b'Torah Moshe Rabbeinu ad shenamin b'chol dvareinu u'mekareinu shekulam nisim in behem teva u'minhago shel olam. Anybody that has a chilek in Torah, he must believe that this is true. That there's no such thing as nature and the way in which the world works. There's no such thing as a natural system that's any less miraculous, ultimately, philosophically, than open miracles. Whether you're talking about something that happens to many people or to singular individuals. If a person does mitzvahs and he'll be successful, he'll get reward. And if a person does an avera, he's going to get punished for it. These are all clearly decrees in which God wants the world to work. Like I mentioned earlier. Well, actually, before we go into that, so why are those clear displays of miracles? Mitzvos, RAMBAN elaborates this on other works that he's written. The fact that I should get a certain good fortune coming to me because I put on tefillin today, from a natural perspective, so to speak, somebody thinks that there's clear cause and effect as everything happens on a molecular, physical level. You don't really understand why that should happen. You don't really understand why a person should have good fortune for doing mitzvahs, why a person should be punished if he does averos, ones that don't, overtly lead to, let's say bad characteristics in a person. Because the RAMBAN says if you believe in schar v'onesh, if you believe in reward and punishment, by definition you have to believe in a world that is beyond nature. Because nature doesn't describe those phenomena. It doesn't describe the concept of a person being rewarded for the good deeds that he does. At least for many of them, it's that a person does. It doesn't seem to have any direct correlation to fortune and good things that happen to a person in a person's life. Or that there's a correlation, but there's no understanding of causation there whatsoever. Right? So the RAMBAN is saying that itself testifies to a miraculous nature of the world. And this miracle of reward and punishment, that's something that's made clear in the brachos and klalos you have later in the Torah. And we don't need to see the rest inside. He quotes psukim in Devarim where Moshe Rabbeinu talks about these matters in the Tovacha, etc., where there's a concept of reward and punishment that's made very clearly. So that itself, if you were to take that statement of the RAMBAN, if I was to what would you say? And some do say this. what would you say if I said a person actually believes that there's a natural system in which the world works, right? If you were to, let's say, see the Exodus decoded, right, and you see that there's a rational basis to how the world works, and how the miracles, they could happen in natural means. They could happen through a volcano, etc. All these things. Would the Ramban be calling such a person a heretic? That was something that was a discussion on Saturday night. Is this a matter of contention between the two?
I don't think so.
So why not? What would be the? Well, why is that not the same?
Absolutely.
Because I think the point was this could happen. They're not ruling out that they're not saying definitely that this did happen this way, but that it could happen. I think the ultimate thing is we believe in Hashem, and Hashem can do anything. And if Hashem wanted to do it this way, then he could do it this way. If he wanted to do it in a different way, then he would do it in a different way. So I think if a person believes that in Hashem, and that he can do anything, then I don't think we can rule that out. This is just one way that Hashem could do it. It's not saying that this is natural, so we're excluding Hashem from the story.
From the process, right?
It's Hashem is the key, and he can do whatever he wants, however he wants it done.
So if those are the only theological concepts that a person was bound to, I would say for sure that that's the case, right? That a person, can certainly believe in. He says, who's the one that's creating all of these things, these natural processes, so to speak? It's God. But what the Ramban is saying here is something additional. He's saying an additional level, something that he thinks, or he might be saying, that a person has to believe, perhaps, is that a person has to understand that there's no such thing as natural, no such thing as nature.
Sure, if he said that, I'm not sure you have to understand.
I'm not either.
That. You're not.
Right.
Okay.
There are people, this came up more relevantly when we were talking about issues of, books being published about trying to conform science's view of the age of the universe with the Torahs, for example. They really tried to ascribe everything to natural processes and saying, those books were saying God is behind everything that's going on in this process. I'm not denying that whatsoever. Doing what you were saying, scientists are. You could be a firm Jewish scientist saying God's behind all these things. I believe that it's through natural processes that God is behind and is allowing all these things to happen.
Yeah, but it goes one step forward. It's not a question.
Exactly.
If God wants to do that, then he'll do it. That's not the point. It's there. It's not if. Yes, it's there. Those miracles
elaborate
is part of the nature.
Right. So the Ramban seems to be saying, and he seems to be saying that you can't just believe that God is behind everything and be okay. He's saying to some extent the person has to believe in miracles in the sense of intervention, of a natural process which God is intervening in, that he's getting in the way of. Again, that's what it seems to be that he's saying. If you look, and I didn't bring all the sources that you can display this with. Rabbi Dr. David Berger, also an attachment to that article also, he describes, if you look in other works of the Ramban, if you look in other things that he says, the Ramban very clearly understands that there is a world out there that is not just following a, so to speak, constant miracle system. That the Ramban does talk about, let's say, with regards to Hashgacha Pratis, with a person's, divine providence, whether a person gets rewarded or punished, or he has specific assistance from God, and how, depending on his level of righteousness. The Ramban says a person that's not an absolute tzaddik, not an ultimately righteous person, such a person is, so to speak, liable for accidents to happen to him. The Ramban uses the term of accidents, or whatever the Hebrew is. Can't recall it off the top of my head. When you say accidents, you're saying that there's a natural system in place that could play a role in a person's life if he's not an incredibly righteous person. The Ramban himself agrees to some extent with this concept of nature. How do you square that with what he says here? So Dr. Berger suggests that the Ramban, especially if you see how he continues after making that statement, that everything is miraculous, he says specifically with regards to reward and punishment. Specifically with regards to whether or not a person gets rewarded for the good deeds he does and punished for the bad deeds he does, that's where there is, so to speak, a beyond nature, a beyond causation system. And the Ramban is saying that's what a person must believe in. However, in the way that the world works, so to speak, in the way that these perhaps miracles can happen, there's a lot of room to say that there is, so to speak, a natural process, some kind of system in which God is I wouldn't say totally uninvolved. That would be what the Ramban himself says at the very beginning. He's denying, but that there is in some ways an autopilot. That God could be okay with allowing to happen. He'll intervene when he needs to. He certainly knows what's going on the whole time. But there is, so to speak, a concept of leaving things to chance for people that aren't deserving of specific, overseeing.
That's exactly. It's an excellent example of explaining what we're talking about. The world can be an autopilot. Somebody had to push the button to put it on autopilot. Mm-hmm. That's what RAMBAN
And that there are times.
If you don't believe that somebody pushed the button to put it on autopilot, then you're kofar.
Right. And the Ramban say that somebody who agrees with, let's say, the miracles being explained in a natural manner in Yetzias Mitzrayim, he doesn't subscribe to it, because those are all examples of where the Ramban says that those are things taking place where God intervenes with nature, like he said at the beginning. But would he call somebody a heretic if they could explain it away? He doesn't. If you look, actually, there's a drasha that the Ramban wrote called Torah Hashem Temima, where the Ramban, he takes on the works of the Rambam, which we'll see in the following sources, where he discusses the Rambam's view, and that it corresponds very much with the film we saw on Saturday night. The Ramban takes it on, but not from the perspective of saying, like, how could you explain this through natural means, etc. It's more, he's a little upset at the fact that the miracles are minimized, in the sense that there isn't so much of a playing up of the fact that there's skar v'onish. It's a very complicated topic. But just to see what the Rambam Maimonides says, if you look in the next sources from I brought these in English because they were originally written in Arabic. I don't feel any need to give you the original Hebrew on this. It's all a translation. But so his comment in the Guide to Perplexed. So that's I guess more the most primary source where he says this idea. But I guess the more condensed, we'll go to that. There's a Mishnah in Avos where it says, "Asar Dvar Nivru be'erev Shabbos." There were 10 things that God created on Erev Shabbos. This is the words of Chazal, not the Rambam. Bein HaShMashos, during twilight, in between, where it's not quite Shabbos yet, not quite the end of day 6 anymore. Ve'elohim, these are what they are. Pia Aretz, Upia Be'er, the mouth of the earth. If you look, that's referring to the mouth of the earth that swallows up Korach. The mouth of the well, the Be'er Miriam, I think that's referring to. Upia Asan, the mouth of the donkey that spoke to Bilam. Ma'akeshes, the rainbow, Vahaman, the manna, etc., etc. He's talking about a lot of things that are viewed by us as miraculous occurrences. Later on in the Torah, when these things occur, we say, wow, that's a change in nature. But you have this Mishnah Navos that seems to have Chazal saying these are things that were created, built in, at the time of creation. So Maimonides, in his description, in his commentary to this Mishnah, also it's in Arabic, so I only have the English with a typo apparently. So he says in the 8th introductory chapter, I guess that you shouldn't be there, I have already mentioned that the sages do not maintain that there is a change in the divine will at any time. Instead, at the very beginning of the creation of all the entities, the potential for everything that they would do is invested in their nature. That there was engineered within these things from the very beginning, even though they don't occur all the time within these objects, it was engineered that certain things could take place. This applies whether the matter concerned is a natural event that repeats itself frequently, or it's a wonder that happens only on one occasion. Therefore, the Mishnah states that on the 6th day of creation, the earth was granted the potential to swallow Korach and his company, the well to provide water, the donkey to speak, etc. The same applies to the other examples. What he's saying is, essentially, you can believe, the Rambam says that this is what you perhaps should believe, is that how did Yetzias Mitzrayim happen? How did all the Makos happen? Through certain realities of the world that existed from the very beginning. That there's potential in the world that volcanoes can erupt and cause all the sorts of things that were discussed. We talk about the sea drying up in certain areas, allowing for an area to cross, and then all the ways that we explained it. The Rambam would say, yeah, you can explain a natural phenomenon, and you can say that was built in at the time of creation that those things could happen. It's still miraculous in the sense that it's the timing is pretty good. That worked out well for us. But the Ramban, Nachmanides, he takes the Rambam to task on this. He says you're trying to make things a little bit too naturalistic. You're trying to make it a little bit too easily explainable. The Ramban prefers to say that these are actually, there's a natural system that was made in place. I don't know what the Ramban would do with this Mishnah and Avos, but the Ramban says that there's things that were naturally put into place, and the sea by no means should split up or turn into anything that resembles blood by a natural system. It's just that when God saw the need to do so, He would step in. He would make changes. He would change the natural system in a way that it would work out better for the Jews, because that was necessary for the time being. That's the Ramban's approach to things. So again, I don't know what he would do with this Mishnah on Avos. I don't know what his reaction would be to the film we saw. But that's the Ramban's approach. He prefers to say that the world exists in a certain way, and that there's interventions by God that not only do they happen, but they prove a lot of tremendous ideas in our faith. The Rambam probably wouldn't deny those essential ideas that we said earlier, that this proves God's existence, that these things happen. Because at the same time, like we said, even though you could explain them through natural means, the fact that they happened at that time to that people, for those reasons, you have to see a divine hand in that for sure.
But wouldn't he consider that Ramban's point of view is a diminution of God's?
Right, so that's another point. If you look actually in the Guide to Perplex source that we have, I didn't look at it inside, but the Rambam explains what would be your motivation to not explain this as just God got involved. He messed around with the natural system. That why would you want to say that he arranged that these things should happen from the very beginning, so to speak? Because that attests to the perfection of creation in a much greater way, right? If a person has to edit something, so to speak, he has to make changes. That itself attests that it wasn't perfect. The world wasn't perfect to begin with. God made mistakes, so to speak.
I think that God got caught unawares.
Right, exactly. When you say that the world was created from this way in the beginning, there's no surprises to God. He knew all these things would happen, and the world was created in that perfect manner that these things should happen in a natural system. And that's the desire to say things in the way that he does. Whereas the Ramban, he would prefer to say things that are more miraculous in nature, probably because of what we read before. The miracles themselves testify in a certain way to God's. The more of a change they are, the more there's the proof within the incidents of providence, of the fact that God is specifically involved in everybody's life, and he'll step in accordingly. Again, the Rambam would not disagree with those principles. I think he just he narrates the story in a way in which perhaps there's more room to also explain things in a natural way.
Why does it have to be either or? Why can't God be involved in our lives and still have this? When the world was created, God kept saying, and it's good. It's good. So, is not the world supposed to be perfect when God created it? And therefore, God knows everything that's going to happen. And so he built in, let's say the volcano or whatever. But why cannot that happen and still God watches us and is involved in our lives? Why do we have to have?
I think the Rambam would say that. He would say that God is certainly involved in your lives, and certainly on the realm of reward and punishment. He would say that that's the case. With regards to intervention in natural affairs, I think that's where this machlokes, where this debate really lies. I think that's where people draw their lines.
Ramban's view, I think, goes on more with free will, because if we really were granted free will, what does our free will mean then? If it was already predestined that exactly on such and such moment of time we would have such and such miracle happen? Because if it's free will, we could have a general idea of what our destiny should be, but it could have been up or down a little bit depending on the generation. I think the Nachmanides, the Ramban's way, goes on more with free will, and then Hashem intervenes.
This is the fundamental contradiction which we have to try to understand if Baruch Hu sees the future and does not force the future.
Right.
I'm a little unclear on the connections we're making. Why is Ramban's approach more central to free will?
Because basically, if man was really, really given true free will, even though God knows what's going to happen over there, then I think if man could have pushed this exodus to happen earlier or later, depending on the way they behave, the way that man behaves, and then Nachmanides would be, I think, correct saying that, okay, at this point now Hashem has to intervene. If he really, it's true that he knows ahead of time, but it's difficult.
Yeah, okay. I see how it touches on the contradiction.
It's a problem that we always have.
Meaning if you define it as a natural system.
The Akeda again, we talked about this.
Right. We talked about that concept of free will. That's serious.
But it becomes even more difficult if we talk about the set being created, Banish Mashot, which means it's all anticipated. So what is the Atayadati Kiriya? It becomes even more difficult to understand that particular phrase.
When you look at it,
if the set was already ready on the day of creation.
Right. If you look at it from the scope of this Mishnah and Avos, or the Rambam's approach, that implies that if the Jews had been deserving of getting out earlier,
That's
right, the miracles wouldn't have happened because they were engineered to happen later, right? Right. So that'll I think touch on that stira that we have. That we have to live with, that we have to understand in some ways that they can both exist without actually contradicting each other, that God knows everything that's going to happen, and He therefore can engineer it in the way that it will. While at the same time we do have free will. The Ramban, like you mentioned, will have less difficulty with that, because it's dependent on your actions, and at that moment God can decide, you guys are good, you're deserving it, let me make that change right now. So, right, so the Ramban's approach will lean more towards it's dependent on our actions. The Rambam's approach will lean more towards the perspective that God knows everything that's going to happen. He's engineering it in that direction. But at the end of the day, both of them agree that both concepts are true. It's what do you emphasize? That's very good.
In fact, the issues of Bahira, they have almost the opposite view of what you described.
How so?
Ramban's view of Bahira is that things are predestined. And Maimonides' view is that you are responsible for your acts, that even if it is determined that somebody should die, if you're the person who kills them, you still hold the responsibility for it.
See, the Ramban doesn't agree with Bahira in that sense?
Ramban has a view that vergers at times, I'll have to find exactly where it is, but it's interesting, that the issue of tshuva is a very interesting question, because if in the end of the day, if in the end of the process, everything is predetermined, then there's no reason for tshuva. There is no such thing as mitzvah, there's no such thing.
Because I think everybody has to agree with Bahira. Everybody has to understand that as a concept central in Judaism. The Ramban, in some ways, denies it?
Yeah, in places he does. Much more so than...
Okay, well, I mean, we talked about hardening his heart, Paro's heart last week, and the Ramban seems to say at certain points Bahira is taken away, but as a general principle, I think he would subscribe.
I'm not sure.